This is passage 1 of AAMC Section Bank 2. Although the perceived need for personal property varies by culture, home ownership is often associated with both physical and physiological well-being. For example, previous research has found that the transition from being a renter to homeowner leads to increases in self-worth. So we're going to highlight that. But differences in the quality of housing are so relevant to well-being. For example, and then when I'm reading the passage, I always like to highlight this part right here. The levels of daily noise an individual is exposed to are partially determined by housing location. Daytime exposure to noise has been found to reduce the amount of time spent in REM sleep. So this right here is a claim. So research has shown that this part right here, daytime exposure, has been led to decrease in REM sleep. While exposure to noise during sleep leads to shifts from deeper to lighter sleep stages, in the mid-20th century, the United States government introduced numerous policies that aggressively promoted home ownership, and thus many Americans who were adults during the time hold the majority of their wealth in the value of their home. So now study 1, I like to highlight the study 1s, and so each study right here, so I know what you're to look at back in the paragraph. Found that the relationship between homeownership and physiological well-being varies based on how personally responsible for and capable of maintaining the value of their property the homeowner feels. Surprisingly, homeowners who express a greater belief that they could increase the value of their home through personal effort also reported lower well-being. Okay, now study 2, which was completed over a 10-year period, examined how fluctuations in housing values impacted older adults' physiological functioning. Financial records were used to assess housing value. Physiological and cognitive functioning was assessed at the beginning and at the end of the data and collection period, using the same tasks each time. And task 1, again, I would like to highlight these functions of each experiment. Participants complete a serial subtraction exercise where they subtracted 7 from 100 and each a subsequent number until reaching 0. And task 2, participants were asked to recall as many words as possible from a list they had been presented with 15 minutes prior. Participants will also complete a self-report assessment of anxious and depressive symptomology, where higher scores indicated greater symptomology. Results found that female participants' increases in property values were associated with decreased anxious symptomology across the data collection period. For all participants, increased property values were associated with improved performance on the task 2 during the secondary assessment. So I'm just highlight that part. And so that is passage 1. All right, question number 1. Which variable was most likely to function as a moderator of study 2's results? Okay, so the question is saying the function of a moderator, which I know from my content review means moderator variable, and I'll explain that what that is in just a second. And then it's asking from study 2's results. So let's go back to study 2 quickly. So if you look at paragraph 3, which was completed over a 10-year period, examined how fluctuations in housing values impacted older adults' physiological functioning. So this is all I need right now. So basically, dumb it down. Basically, how do housing prices affect adults' physiological function? Perfect. So that's all we need to know for the answer to this question. So let's look at moderator mean. What does moderator variable mean? So if I pull up like a screenshot right up here. So basically, an moderator variable is when it's kind of like it's the gateway regulator between the independent variable and the dependent variable. So let's say, my independent variable was like stress, right? Okay, let's say I just took an exam, I'm very stressed out, okay? And then the result of that stress is depression. So that's our dependent variable, because dependent variable is the outcome of the independent variable. And so what the moderator variable is, it's like the gateway regulator, like I said. So let's say you had some friends come over, right? Like, hey man, you're so down. And so they give you that support. And so as there's support, it kind of regulates how much stress goes through. So if there's more social support in between this gateway, less depression. So you can think of it as like as a gate. It's like how much does it let through, like a valve, like a how much in your blood vessel allows how much blood to go through, if you want to think of it that way. So basically, regulator. That's all we need to know. That's what it means for it to be a moderate variable. Okay. Choice A. Let's look at, so it says participant age. Okay, so I'm right off the bat, I'm not gonna say it's A because it didn't really specify a really specific age at all in the passage. It just said, okay, older adults. It didn't really like pinpoint an exact specific age. So for now, I don't think A is not a really strong answer. So I'll come back to that later. For now, I'm just gonna cross it off. Okay, participant gender. So if you look at the last paragraph, it says right here, results found that for female participants, increases in property values were associated with decreased anxious symptomology across data for the collection period. So it's found that female participants were different from the male participants if you look back. So it's actually decreased the anxious symptomology. So we could say that, yeah, it could be a possible moderate variable because the gender in this case kind of impacts how much of the dependent variable we're getting, basically. So I think gender so far is a good answer. I'm gonna keep it. Now let's look at C. C is a very tempting answer, but I'm not gonna say it's a very good answer. And reason is because it says baseline property values. And so if you remember correctly, if you already know enough that the housing values, it's more acting like our independent variable, right? And because that independent variable, it affects our dependent variable, which is the physiological functioning. And so baseline property values is more of an independent variable than a moderating variable. So I'm not going to say it's C. And finally, D, it's the same what I explained before. Um, adults' physiological function. It's more of a dependent variable rather than a moderating variable. And so they were trying to assess the dependent variable, which is the physiological symptomology. They were trying to find the physiological symptoms of the independent variable, which was the housing values. So I'm not gonna say it's D. And so what we're left with is B. Even though B is not like doesn't seem like a very straightforward answer, it's the only one that makes sense because B, A, C, and D really it's like C and D. I didn't say because these are more independent and dependent variable, and I knew this didn't really specify age, so I'm gonna say it's B because gender was the only one that makes the most sense out of the three other answer choices. And that is question number 1. All right, question number 2, a passage 1 for the AAMC Section Bank. So according to the passage, homeownership is least likely to be associated with which need from Maslow's hierarchy of needs. So what I'd like to do is right here highlight least, just so I don't remember, so I don't forget. And that's asking Maslow. So Maslow, we did refer back to our content review. So if you look here, this is the pyramid. This is something you should actually memorize and be familiar with because we have physiological needs, safety needs, belongingness and love, esteem needs, and self-actualization. And so let's look at the answer choices one by one. So let's start with belongingness. So if we look at belongingness right here, the definition is that it's basically being intimate with relationships and having friends and being social. So but throughout the passage, if we think about it as a whole, what they really talk about? They just talked about houses and people like having this type of physiological functioning based on the housing values. There was like no shape and form they were discussed about like, okay, there's like this friendship going on and stuff. So I think so far it's like the best good strong answer, but I'll come back to that later. So for now I'm keeping it. So now if you look at B, esteem. Okay, so what is esteem? So basically it's something how much we value ourselves. And so if you look at paragraph 1 right here, it really does talk about this a lot. So for example, previous research has found that the transition from being a renter to a homeowner leads to increases in self-worth. Self-worth, aka self-esteem. And so this has to do a lot with it. So we can cross this off safely because it's asking for what is the least. And so B right now could be a good answer to eliminate. And so C, physiological. So physiological, what does that mean is require food, water, warmth, or rest. So like a house kind of provides that shelter, to the person. And so we can say safely for sure that yes, uh, being a homeowner can be physiologically related because you want that house shelter. And so I can cross it off because it has to do with it. And then safety. So safety, like it's being like having security or being safe. So then safety can be also mean that you're also financially stable, because if you look at paragraph 2 right here, they talk about where the during that time hold the majority of their wealth and value of their home. And so basically their wealth is kind of like their financial stability. So in their case, their safety. And so we can say that safety can be a part of this, and so it's pretty well part of this as well. So we can safe across ID. And so belongingness makes the most sense. It's like the strongest answer between B, C, and D. So I would choose this because mainly because as we know, there's no intimacy or relationship at all in the paragraph. It was just talking about houses the whole time, and so these have to do more with like C and D and B, and so A is the correct answer. And that is question 2. Okay, question number 3. Which construct did study 1 examine in relation to physiological well-being? So now let's look at study 1. So we already have it highlighted right here. So study 1 found that the relationship between home ownership and physiological well-being varies based on how personally responsible for and capable of maintaining the value of the property the homeowner feels. Surprisingly, homeowners who express a greater belief that they could increase the value of their home through personal effort also reported lower well-being. Okay, so this is all information we need right here. So this part can help us solve this problem. So let's look at these answer choices one by one. So let's look at A, cognitive dissonance. So basically it's when you have two contradicting beliefs. So let's say, for example, I'm smoking, right? When I smoke, I know very well that smoking is bad for me, it's harmful for me, but yet I continue to smoke. And so it's when you have kind of like two beliefs that are different from each other, but yet you still continue to do it. There's nowhere in this part right here it says that, where they're being contradictory to each other. And so I can safely say it's not A because they're just talking about how their own value themselves can increase through their personal effort can increase the value of their home. And so I'm not gonna say it's A. Now let's look at B, learned helplessness. So basically it's kind of like based on what I read right here, it's kind of like almost sounds like the opposite because we know that learned helplessness is when you're given a stimulus, but no matter what you do, there's nothing you can do to stop it. And so basically right here it says the homeowners, like I said, it's the opposite. They believe that they can increase the value of their home through personal effort. And so that's kind of like the opposite almost of like learned helplessness. So I'm not gonna say it's B. I can cross that out. Now, self-efficacy is a pretty pronounced answer, I would say, because if this last sentence is like almost the definition of self-efficacy, because it's the belief of how much our outcome can affect the result, basically. And so the homeowners are expressing their value of like, yeah, I can do it. I can increase the value of my home. And so C seems like a pretty strong answer. Now D, it's almost like almost seems like almost good as C, but D isn't wrong because self-esteem is our self-worth. It's basically how much good of a person we are. It does not have to do with anything about like, okay, I have this belief that I want to increase the value of my home. It's more like the value of ourself. So C is a better answer than D, and so I'm gonna select C. And that is question 3. All right, question number 4. Which statement about the relationship between noise and sleep is best supported by the passage? So recall we highlighted this part right here. Daytime exposure to noise has been found to reduce the amount of time spent in REM sleep, while exposure to noise during sleep leads to shifts from deeper to lighter sleep stages. So I'm just gonna pull this diagram right here just for the sake for visualization. So I think it's best to go through these answer choices one by one based on what we read on the passage. So A says exposure to noise while sleeping decreases the amount of slow wave sleep. So yeah, I think this answer choice makes a lot of sense because it says right here, while exposure to noise during sleep at least shifts from deeper to lighter sleep. So what happens is when we go into deep sleep, our sleep waves they become very slow, and versus when we go to like lighter sleep stages, like for example REM, we get like these up and down arrows. It goes crazy, and so it's saying right here if we go from deeper to lighter. So if I expect us to go from deeper to lighter, I get less slow waves, and so this makes sense because it says it decreases the amount of slow wave sleep. So A so far seems to be a good answer. So let's look at B now. Exposure to daytime noise increases the number of dreams experienced at night. So again, B is wrong because if you look right here, it says daytime exposure to noise has been found to reduce the amount of time in REM sleep. REM sleep is when we have our dreams, and so this actually decreases the amount of dreams, so it's not going to be B. And then C, exposure to daytime noise is more likely to impact sleep earlier in the night than later in the night. And so this is actually the opposite because we know that these type of sleeps, like, REM sleep, for example, is known to happen later in the night, not early in the night, because that's when we kind of drift off and we're having light sleep right now. REM sleep is kind of like a little bit later. And so it can't be C because it's gonna say it happens earlier, but it does happen later though. So I'm not gonna say it's C. Exposure to noise during sleep is less likely to lead to daytime sleepiness. And so when we have less sleep, so when we go from like less deeper to So when we go to more from deeper to lighter sleep stages, we're more likely to get more tired because we don't get that sleep cycle because our sleep cycle doesn't become complete. Because if we keep getting less and less deep sleeps, then we're more likely to become tired throughout the day. And so D cannot be a good answer because it's saying that we get less sleeplessness. So, but actually, it's the opposite. We're actually getting more sleepy. So D can't be the correct answer. So A is the most strong answer. And that's question number 4. All right, question number 5. Which statement best summarizes study two's results? So let's go back to study 2. So the results right here. So it says that increased probability values were associated with decreased anxious symptomology across the data collection period for all participants. Increased probability values were associated with improved performance on task 2 during the second assessment. So this was their data right here. So they said that basically increased power values were associated with improving performance. Okay, so let's look at our answer choice and see if it like lines up with the results right here. So A, increases to property values cause improvements in cognitive function in older adults. So right off the bat, I'm like already suspicious that this is already wrong because it says right here, cause to property values cause. So remember when we're dealing with something like correlational study inside the passage, you have to know that you just have to remember that correlation does not cause causation. And let's say if this this whole passage was experimental, then yeah, maybe we can safely say it could be A because of the word cause. But the thing is, though, correlation does not show causation, so we can't say it's A. So I'm gonna eliminate it because of that. So now let's look at B. There was a positive correlation between changes in property values and changes in performance on task 2. So remember, if you go back to task 2 right here, they said higher scores indicated greater symptomology. And so they said right here in the bottom, increased property values were associated with improved performance on task 2 during the second assessment. So in that case, the scores and the property values were somehow positively correlated because they're both increasing, right? So that means it has to be B because B is a strong answer because it's showing that positive correlation. So I'm going to hold on to that for now. And now if you look at C, there was a negative correlation between the baseline property values and baseline depressive symptomology. Now, for me, this could be tempting, but the thing is, it mentions baseline property values and baseline depressive. There was nowhere in the passage discussing about like comparing the baselines. They just said, okay, we're looking at the increases in property values were associated with decreased anxious symptomology. They didn't really get provided baseline, and so we can't really say it's C because there's no baseline provided at all. And D, there was a spurious association between changes in property values and changes in psychological symptomology. Now, what the heck is spurious association? It's something when like you have a fake data point and it really isn't representative or like it's kind of gives you like a false idea of the correlation. But even if you didn't know the definition of that, you would still say B because B is still much a stronger answer than D because we know that the performance on task 2 and the property values are both positively correlated. I don't think there was much better, a stronger answer than D. So even if you didn't know that and you're choosing between B and D, you'll still pick B because because of B being much stronger than D, even if you didn't know the definition of spurious. So B is the correct answer. All right, question number 6. Which concept is most relevant to the passage discussion? So we can just go through these answer choices one by one because the question doesn't give us anything to go off of. So we can just start going through the answer choices right away. Okay, A, demographic transition. So the definition of that is basically it's when a population changes its demographic in such as race, gender, and stuff. So like the ratio of it changes over time. But we were just talking about house just now. We were just like talking about how housing values impact older adults' psychological functioning, right? So this has nothing to do with it. So we can eliminate A. And if you look at B, differential association, it basically means that we learn our deviant behavior from others just by observing them. There was no, I don't know about you, but no deviant behavior was discussed at all or anything that's related to the passage. So you could say it's not B. Front stage behavior is when we show our scripted selves to the public, but when in the backstage behavior, we become our own selves in the back of behind the people. So like we don't show our true selves in front of others. But basically, that's not really talking about that in the passage. It doesn't show we're like it's not related to like what we're talking about this discussion of the passage. So it can be C. Social determinants of health. This one makes the most sense. And if you think about it, housing values vary from person to person. It can depend on their socioeconomic status, their financial stability, and so this can potentially affect how they're physiologically functioning. And so a person's social determinant can affect just that. So D makes the most sense because of their socioeconomic status can affect the house they're buying for their value. So D is the correct answer. And that is question number 6, and that's the end of passage 1.